We have all heard the term angel of death. Usually it is referred in modern times as a nurse that kills their patients. When we go to the hospital, because we become more ill than what our family doctor can handle, or we become injured or involved in an accident, we will seek our treatment out at a hospital. While in the hospital, we trust that the medical staff will assist in improving our health to return home. What we don't expect is for the medical staff to cause our health to decline or make an attempt at murdering us while we are in the care of the hospital. There's a lot of people that don't trust hospitals, doctors, etc., and for good reason. Not usually for the reasons that they might attempt at murdering us through and making it look like an accident. That usually isn't a thought that would cross our minds. Maybe not until recently, when a documentary and a movie was released on Netflix that may have brought it to the forefront of our minds. In Somerset, New Jersey, there was a nurse that was convicted of murdering his patients over the course of his career. He confessed to 29 murders, but it was believed that he had committed around 400 murders. And before he would be accused or be suspected of murdering his patients, he would leave a hospital and then move on to the next one. With the nursing shortage at the time being the way it wasn't hard for him to find a new job relatively quickly. And then once hired at the new hospital, he could continue his killing spree. Well, tonight we're going to get into another angel of death, an angel of death that had conducted her deadly sins in Clarksburg, West Virginia. This case isn't so well known except to the locals of West Virginia. She would conduct her killing spree in the VA hospital, as if a regular hospital wouldn't have been bad enough, but an attack on our war heroes who gave up everything for this country and were trying to carry out their lives in peace and go in for routine procedures or minor illnesses. These veterans were being attacked by an enemy who no one would expect. It would be someone who should have been treating them rather than killing them. Welcome to the Campfire. Grab your s'mores and grab a seat around the fire. I am your host, Kevin. This is the Campfire Crime Chronicles, a true crime podcast. Thanks for joining me tonight around the campfire as we get into the case of Reta Mays. Now, before we get into the case, I have a couple of things to announce and discuss. First, I had made an error on the last episode about Reta Mays and about the location of where her body was found. In the episode, I had mentioned that it was found on Fairmount Avenue. However, her body was discovered on Fairview Avenue. In my notes, it was a typo that I had, and I never caught it in my editing stages to make the correction. So my apologies there. Next order of business, around this warm winter night around the fire, I had some jackwagon on social media attempt at harassing not only myself, but other listeners and contributors on social media. So before blocking him and banning him from the campfire, I had discovered that he supports terrorism and other cult-like organizations and had reported him to the proper channels to deal with him. So hopefully they have, but we'll see. The last episode had the highest amount of listens and downloads over the past couple of weeks. So thank you everyone who has downloaded and listened to the podcast on your favorite podcast app, as well as the website and on YouTube. I appreciate everything and everyone. So now that everyone has had a chance to grab a s'more and a seat around the campfire tonight, let's jump into the case. Reta Phyllis Mays, born June 16th, 1975, age 46. She was born in Reynoldsville, West Virginia. Mays was in the U.S. Army National Guard from November of 2000 to April of 2001, and then in February of 2003 to May of 2004, where she was deployed to Iraq and Kuwait with the 1092nd Engineer Battalion in a non-combat position. Prior to her deployment as a nurse's aide, she was a corrections officer with West Virginia Department of Corrections at the North Central Regional Jail located in Greenwood, West Virginia from 2005 to 2012. During her employment at the jail, she was investigated several times for excessive force. I wasn't able to find anything about her employment from 2012 to 2015, so I don't have any information for those 3 years. However, in June of 2015, Mays began employment as a nurse's aide at the Lewis A. Johnson Veterans Medical Center in Clarksburg, West Virginia. Starting in 2017, she began the overnight shift on the hospital's surgical unit, Ward 3A. Her responsibilities at the hospital included taking patients' vital signs and blood glucose levels with a glucometer. The VAMC nursing assistants are not qualified or authorized to administer any medication. This would also include insulin to patients. At the time of Rita's employment, the hospital's nursing assistants were not required to have a certificate or license as a condition of employment. She often would spend a lot of her time sitting with patients and would be unsupervised. So, quite quickly into this episode, you can see where her window of opportunity is, where she can have access to medications as well as being able to administer the medications to the patients that don't need those medications, such as the insulin. So there's not a whole lot of actual background information other than what I had just told you guys about Rita. A lot of the information about this case comes through the interviews that were conducted later on. So now we're going to get into the victims. One of her first victims was George Shaw. Shaw was a decorated veteran who served 28 years in the Air Force during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. He served from 1951 to 1982. In March of 2018, he was admitted to the ER by his family when he experienced weakness and difficulty in breathing and worried that it might be an issue as a result of the heart condition that he was diagnosed with. After an evaluation, doctors told the family that he will be home soon, and they kept him for observation before they would release him. They would move him to Ward 3A. Mays would conduct her murders between 2017 and 2018. So, amongst her other victims, along with Shaw, was Robert Edge, a Navy veteran who served from 1952 to 1956. Then was Robert Kozul, an Army veteran who served from 1951 to 1953. Now, I am quite horrible at pronunciations, so if I get the pronunciations of some names wrong, my apologies. Archie Edgill was an Army veteran who would serve from 1953 to 1955. Then we have George Shaw, who we discussed. And then Felix McDermott, an Army veteran who served from 1962 to 1968. We have Raymond Golden, a dual Army and Air Force veteran who served from 1951 to 1953, and then 1955 to 1973. William Holloway, who served in the Army from 1942 to 1945. So those are Rita's victims. So now we're going to get into the investigation. The investigation into the deaths began June of 2018 and would take over 2 years. When the investigation started, investigators within the VA would begin showing up to Clarksburg within 24 hours. The investigation began internally with Veteran Affairs, and then as the investigation progressed, the FBI would become involved. During the investigation, investigators would say there wasn't any hard evidence such as fingerprints, eyewitnesses, or even syringes that would be left in the trash or sharps boxes. However, the circumstantial evidence they would collect would all point to Rita, which would make her a person of interest from the beginning of the investigation. Mays would be interviewed and questioned 3 times. Each time, she would deny any involvement into the deaths and also deny ever going into the med room. Mays would remain free during the investigation. So during the investigation, Mays was moved off of Ward 3A, and miraculously, surprisingly, the killings had all stopped. So we get into interview 1, which takes place about a month after the investigation begins. So the first interview lasted an hour. In this interview, Mays would deny any involvement in a crime. She would complain early on in the interview about being overworked as well as being pulled from the ward and her responsibilities. Then, periodically in the interview, she would cry and would say that things were being missed in connections with the patients and the low blood sugars. The investigators would focus on those comments. So the investigator would ask Rita, and I quote, "What are you leaving out? Because some people omit things and it still makes them feel bad. So what is it that you could be omitting that is making you feel what you feel now?" Then Mays would respond, "I'm not omitting anything, okay?" So now we go back to the investigator, quoting, "So you haven't done anything or know of anybody that's done anything wrong?" End quote. Then Mays would respond, "No, I don't know of anybody that's done anything," also adding that she was being honest. Brandon Flowers, who was the assistant U.S. attorney, stated that Mays would repeat herself during the interview. One of the statements that Mays would often repeat was the fact that there was things being missed with the low blood sugars and with respect to the patients. Investigators later learned by reviewing internet browsing records that immediately after the first interview, Mays went back to her workstation and began searching the internet for new jobs. During this time, Mays' husband was in jail, and she would make phone calls to her husband and often talked about her patients and work, which investigators obviously were able to get a hold of and listen to. So we're going to listen to some clips from those.
As well as help on the floor. And then I had to, then at midnight, at 4 o'clock in the morning, I had to take over sitting one of the one-on-ones. So the other aides could come out and work on the floor. And the one I was sitting with, I wanted to freaking strangle.
Why?
I couldn't keep him in bed. They had given him P.O. Haldol, and that didn't work. So they gave him 2 shots of Haldol, and he still was wound up. So He finally, at about 6:50, fell asleep.
So, as you heard, there was one of the phone calls she had with her husband, and there were several. That was just one of them. And you heard her talk to her husband and tell him that she could frickin' strangle one of her patients. Now, I've been in the medical field and the fire service, and we all have calls or patients that we don't maybe particularly like or would give us a headache or give us a hard time. And we would vent to usually our spouses, significant others, friends, coworkers, whatever it was who would listen. And, that's what she was doing. But with her track record of murdering her patients, and this one just happened to also be murdered, spoiler alert, then you can see why they kind of took this more literally than figuratively, as I would also. So if you're wondering what her husband Gordon was in prison for and serving time for, he was serving time for child pornography. And so you can see that she definitely had a winner. So, talking about spoiler alerts, that phone call that she made to her husband about wanting to freaking strangle her patient was made the morning after one of those low blood sugar episodes of that patient after Mays had given him insulin. That phone call would go on, and Mays would explain to her husband that, quote, he couldn't do anything for himself and that he had to be fed everything and he had no quality of life in Mays's eyes. And that the previous week they would have just said DNR, he would have went to sleep when his blood sugar dropped down to 30. He would have just went to sleep and not have woken up. We checked his blood sugar in the middle of the code and it was 258, so it wasn't his blood sugar that time. Then Mays would go on to laugh. So after investigators had listened to that phone conversation, they were more convinced they had the right person with Mays. They would go on to explain in a statement, how would an untrained individual know that if a blood sugar level went to 30, they wouldn't have woken up? That was a question that was made by one of the investigators investigating the murders. So now months would go by before investigators would have a second interview with Mays. This interview was conducted by an FBI special agent that would be from Quantico, and this interview had lasted 5 hours. Investigators said that the point of this interview was to gain background and understanding, since at this point they didn't have a motive. So when the investigators brought Mays into the room, they would tell her, quote, today I'm telling you the opportunity you are passing up, end quote. Going on to saying, so tell me what happened, the truth, and I will treat you as I'm treating you this very moment. Nothing you say will shock me or cause me to treat you any differently. After today, I cannot make that promise to you, end quote. There were several minutes that would go before Mays would say anything. Investigators described her reaction as complete shutdown. Mays went back to work and again would search the internet. This time she looked up information about the book I'm Dead Now, which leaves instructions to family members after a person dies. So, after the second interview, that same day, Reta would go out to buy a book called I'm Dead, Now What? Also, there was messages found on her Facebook messengers with coworkers about wanting to kill other patients and also asking about what happened to certain patients, looking for information whether if they had lived or died. A year would go by since the second interview would take place and the third interview would be done. For this interview, investigators would tell Mays that she would be able to come and pick up her cell phone at the office that investigators had obtained through a search warrant. When Mays arrived, they asked her if she would like an update on the case, which she said she would. Then she would agree to speak with them at that point. So for this interview, a different agent would be prepped for the interview who had a similar background as Mays, which also included spending time in the military. The agent and the team spent a couple of weeks prepping for the interview prior to asking Mays to come in. At this point, investigators had an abundance of information that they had accumulated while building up their case against Mays. The interview lasted 6 hours, which they went into Mays' childhood and family life growing up. Their objective was to build up a rapport with Mays to avoid her from shutting down like she had in the second interview. With such a strong circumstantial case built up against Mays, that during the third interview with the investigators, Mays would say, "Looking at this, it does look like I did it." End quote. Soon after the third interview with federal investigators, Mays would make a trip to the courthouse and filed for a court-appointed attorney, even though at this time she wasn't charged with any crimes. She was denied at the courthouse for one, because they would tell her that they can't assign an attorney to her unless she's charged with a crime or named in a target letter from investigators, which Mays would have neither. Although after learning about this, investigators responded with a target letter, and she would receive 3 court-appointed attorneys, which would begin the plea deal negotiations. The investigation would involve over 300 interviews, as well as the review of phone records, social media, computer records, the review of thousands of medical records and charts, including Mays's glucometer that she would show what she had taken the majority of the low blood sugars. By then, investigators had built up a strong circumstantial case against Mays, including her internet search history of female serial killers, her Netflix viewing of series of nurses who kill, one episode of which focused on insulin killings. Now, obviously, you can't charge somebody or accuse somebody of murder just because they watch murder documentaries. If that was the case, then there would probably be thousands or maybe even millions of us who would be accused of murder because we watch murder documentaries, myself included. The investigation would also involve the exhumation of several bodies of patients that had died to do another autopsy and look for insulin specifically. Investigators suspected that Mays killed more than 8 patients during her time at the VAMC. There were 20 suspicious deaths that had occurred. However, prosecutors focused on the 8 that they had substantial evidence for. As most of my listeners know, that the reason they focused on the 8 that they had evidence for was because they didn't want a chance losing the case on one of the suspected deaths that they didn't have hardly any evidence for. So now we're going to get into the guilty plea. On July 14th of 2020, charges were brought up to Mays by way of information. And information is filed by the U.S. Attorney. It means that 2 parties have reached an agreement without a charge, and that the U.S. Attorney will file the charge, and the person in question, in this case Mays, pleads guilty to it. It's believed that Reta saw the evidence that was gathered up against her, and she felt she needed to plead guilty. When negotiating the plea deal for Mays, investigators would consult with the victims' families and whether they were going to seek out the federal death penalty. For the plea deal, it would have to go through and be approved through the U.S. Attorney General, which at the time was William Barr. The plea agreement includes a guilty plea to 7 accounts of second-degree murder and 1 account of assault to commit murder, according to the prosecutor's information. The motives were and still unclear for reasons behind the murders. Mays also was never really clear about how she selected her victims. There was some thoughts of PTSD brought up by Mays' defense attorneys. However, that didn't hold a lot of weight. What she said during an interview after her guilty plea, she stated, quote, she believed they were suffering and administered insulin so they could pass gently. She would also state that she had a lot of stress and chaos in both personal and professional life, and that her actions gave her a sense of control. However, the assistant U.S. Attorney, Jared Douglas, would call her actions predatory and planned, not reactionary. These men were not in need of mercy by the defendant, Douglas said. In the end, it wasn't the defendant's call to make. Also, what contradicts Mays' statements was that 1 or 2 at least of her patients were only in for minor issues or minor illnesses, and they should have had a full recovery within a couple of days. Those patients were by far not suffering at the least bit. So, with Mays' statements, I'm going to call BS on that one. So now we're going to get into the sentencing. People magazine on their website gave Reta Mays the nickname the Angel of Death, which suited her quite perfectly. As I mentioned in the beginning of the episode, the Angel of Death name was and has been used amongst other nurses who have killed. Before the sentence was announced Tuesday, Kazu's daughter-in-law, Becky Kazu, said Mays had confessed to ruining 7 families by robbing us of our loved ones. Why should you ever be allowed out of prison to enjoy freedom? End quote. Before U.S. District Judge Thomas Klee gave Mays her sentence, he told her, quote, you are the worst kind of monster. You're the monster that no one sees coming. End quote. Mays would be charged for second-degree murder involving the deaths of Army veteran Robert Lee Kuzal, Sr., 89, Archie D. Edgell, 84, Felix Kirk McDormand, 82, and William Holloway, 96. Navy veteran Robert Edgar Sr., 82, Air Force veteran George Nelson Shaw, Sr., 81, and Army and Air Force veteran Raymond Golden, 88. On May 11, 2021, Mays was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences for each of the 7 victims and was also sentenced to an additional 20 years for assault with intent to commit murder involving the death of Navy veteran Russell R. Posey, Sr., 92. Posey later died at a nursing home on July 3, 2018. The medical examiner could not conclusively confirm that the insulin with which Mays injected him with had been the direct cause of his death. Mays cried and apologized in addressing the court briefly before learning her sentence. Mays would say, quote, I know that there's no words that I can say that would alter the family's pain and comfort, end quote. She would also go on to say, quote, I don't ask for forgiveness because I don't think I could forgive anyone for doing what I did, end quote. So that concludes tonight's tale at the campfire of the case about Reta Mays. I did a little bit differently tonight with a little bit less information in the background portion of the case and more in the investigation portion of the case, but I feel like it came out okay still. So all resources used to gather the information for the case include, but aren't limited to, news articles, reports, documentaries, as well as other sources. I appreciate everyone who has gathered with me by the campfire for the case with me tonight. Also, if you'd like to listen to ad-free shows as well as bonus episodes and get a shout out on the most recent episode of the podcast, then sign up and join me over at the bonfire. You can find the bonfire over on Patreon, where there are also different tiers that you can choose from. As we progress with growth, more tiers will be added. I appreciate all the support from all the listeners and supporters. Also, if you'd like to support the show but not necessarily sign up for a subscription, you can support the show through the Campfire's S'mores Fund on our website, which you can find at campfirecrimechronicles.com. Also, just by telling your friends and family about the show and to have them listen to an episode, or if they like it, to continue listening to the other episodes wherever they get their podcast. So join me next time in 2 weeks as we gather around the campfire for the next grisly tale. This is the Campfire Crime Chronicles, a true crime podcast.